Valerie is the president of the Historical Society of Greater Lansing, and I certainly did dig that nugget up from about 35 years ago. But Valerie, tell us what's on your agenda these days and what's going on with the Historical Society.
We are going to be having two events this Thursday evening. We are going to be opening our next exhibit in Lansing City Hall, which is called Lansing Goes to War. It looks at the roles that men and women from the local community have played during war, starting from the Civil War and moving through the First Gulf War, as well as looking at the impact of war on the home front. We have a variety of objects, about 150 or so, ranging from hand-carved mementos created by a soldier given to a nurse who nursed after the Battle of Antietam from the Civil War, all the way through objects that were carried during the First Gulf War. We have Lansing State journals announcing the beginning of that, the invasion of Iraq. We have just a fantastic collection of items, and the exhibit has allowed us to pull out some of the lesser known stories about men and women and how they served and how that had an impact on them. Because of course, when one goes to war, it changes your entire life, not only for that moment, but it changes the rest of your existence. And it also changes the community. Every generation, virtually, since the founding of America, there has been a major war. And that doesn't even take into account all the little police actions and, skirmishes here and there.
You told us last time about the War of 1812, the Forgotten War. I mean, we do have forgotten wars. We've had
We do. And the way they're spaced, father, son, grandson, great-grandson, virtually every generation is forced to pick up, go overseas in most cases, and fight battles that become a part of our identity as a country. And their experiences on the battlefield come home with them.
The biggest differences in the history of the wars in the United States is that we've gone from a conscription army to a volunteer army. And I wondered if you found, as you were gathering stories, whether you could sense a difference. Could you? I see. Yeah.
Absolutely. Conscription obviously has played a huge role in people's feelings about war.
Yeah.
And we forget sometimes, too, that, well, once you are X number of decades removed from a war, you no longer are hearing personal stories from people. You're hearing stories that they pass down to their children and to their grandchildren. We're seeing this right now with World War II. World War II soldiers, of course, are dying, and it will not be too many years until they are gone. And it's so different to talk to someone who was actually there. There's a gentleman who volunteers at the Capitol building with us who was a Seabee during World War II. He was drafted in, joined the Navy, and he was 18 years old, fresh out of high school. And hearing him talk about it now as a 90-year-old man, on one hand, it was an adventure for him. He went places he never would have gone otherwise. He was a farm boy from Michigan. There was no reason he was going to go sail the South Pacific otherwise. But he also starts to get quiet after a while as he talks about it, and talks about the fact that now, as a 90-year-old man, he looks back and realizes he was taking people's lives. And he said there's a reason that we conscript young people. Yeah. When you're young, you take orders. It's you or him. You just do what you're told.
You're there to protect
in the heat of the moment. Yeah. And he said you're fighting for the person next to you more than you're fighting for an ideal or a country at that point. But he said at 90 years old, I still sit here and realize there are lives of men on my hands.
Yeah, he does have blood on his hands.
He does. And it's very different from the stories that we pass down to our children and our grandchildren. Those are mostly the stories of adventure, the stories of funny things that happened along the way. Most veterans...
Or nobility, the noble actions of
no,
saving
absolutely.
a friend. Yeah.
Most veterans don't want to share those darker moments, and those become some of the lost pieces of history. When you talk to the grandchild of a soldier who has died, they talk about war was the adventure of my grandfather's life. But that's also because said grandfather never shared the darker moments.
One of the things that I learned, I interviewed Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman, who wrote a book called On Killing. He ran a research group in Arkansas called the Killology Group. And he looked at the statistics related to battlefield, what people did on the battlefield. And when they found out all the way up until the Korean War, no more than 1 out of 5 soldiers ever fired a weapon on the battlefield. They could count the number of slugs in the ground, for example, at the Civil War versus the number of soldiers, and they were able to arrive at that statistic. So the people who ran the military, the logicians, realized that if they could improve the firing odds on the part of the American soldier, then we would win, right? That seems obvious. You get 80% of your people to pull the trigger. 2 things influenced that reality and changed beginning with the Korean War, but especially with the Vietnam War. And one were arcade games and then video games, because it became automatic. It was no longer something you thought about, you just automatically pulled the trigger. And the second thing was no longer emphasizing the noble cause, but emphasizing you are part of a unit and you are responsible for your buddy who is next to you. Those 2 factors, they believe, were what increased the likelihood that people would shoot at other people. But humans aren't built to do that. They really aren't. And what we had then was this dramatic increase in the amount of PTSD in the culture. So I wondered if you ran into some people who, I mean, as you're saying, their experiences, their memories were maybe not the happy.
Right.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it has been difficult finding people who are willing to talk about their experiences.
Willing at all.
We will be hosting in May a panel of a couple of Vietnam veterans, and I will tell you that it's very difficult, and it's difficult for the men who fought there. It's difficult for them to express their stories, and I think you're right. You know, as war becomes less about heroics and more about blood, we don't want to talk about that, and that's natural. But at the same time, it is a part of our history, and as a culture, we need to understand that this is what war brings. You also raise an interesting point about the fact that most people were not actually shooting weapons. That's something we discuss in the exhibit.
Oh, do you?
Men who were soldiers were auto mechanics. There was a gentleman during the First World War who was born and raised in the Lansing area. He was actually in the Ann Arbor area working as a mechanic, buying and selling used cars on the side. And the American Army actually came into Detroit during World War I and said, we need 10,000 mechanics to go overseas, to fix ambulances, to fix cars, to keep things moving. And he was part of this group that went. And his experience was not firing a gun, it was tinkering with engines.
Yeah.
It was keeping cars going. And circumstances being what they were, by the end of the war, he was actually in charge of the garage where President Wilson, General Pershing's cars were kept during the Paris Peace Accords.
Oh, wow.
It's very much not your typical soldier,
Yeah.
but at the same time, he served his country as he knew best. And then, no coincidence, he returned and he opened up a car dealership in Lansing. And that was how he made his living. His daughter actually will be sharing some of the letters that he sent home to his mother, which have been preserved in the family. She will be sharing some of those with us in a program in late March.
When you think about it, I think so many people, young people that I teach who are 18, 20 years old now, don't really understand that 52,000 soldiers were lost during the Vietnam War. We are very keenly aware of the 3,000 soldiers that we've lost in the Middle East conflicts, but when you compare, those were the longest wars ever in American history, but when you compare 52,000 soldiers killed in Vietnam, that had to have had a huge impact on the Lansing community. I mean,
Absolutely. Absolutely. One thing we've struggled with as we put this exhibit together is how much of that do you discuss? You know, you can go back through the state journals and you find lists of names printed, missing in action, soldiers who were killed. And for those who were back home, how terrible was that reality when you open up the newspaper, it's a Thursday afternoon at 4:30,
Right.
and wait a second, there's my first boyfriend.
Right.
There's my neighbor boy growing up. There is the son of the church organist. It's a harsh reality. One of the objects in the exhibit that comes from a personal collection that's on loan to us is actually a telegram sent to a wife in Lansing telling her husband had been killed in action
We
in
regret
1944.
to inform you.
Oh, God,
That's-
that
gosh,
language
it's one of the
no
more-
one ever wants to
It's
hear.
one of the most chilling things I've seen. I've never seen one in real life, so there it was.
This is LCC Radio WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. We're talking with Valerie Marvin of the Historical Society of Greater Lansing about their new exhibit, Lansing Goes to War. And you know, that is, I think, really an interesting point. Bill and I have been talking recently about how we're losing touch with teaching history. The Historical Society really fills a critical gap here in the community because many of the young people that I know, not intentionally, but they are ahistorical. They don't have a historical background or framework, and for some reason they're not getting it. And I think part of it is schools, like any other publicly funded entity, worry about the contentiousness. Everything is politicized nowadays. So it's, I was thinking my favorite history teacher of all time was Bertha Buell. And she had an ability to take the sort of telling fact, which Valerie is brilliant at. She finds the anecdotal story that really sums up exactly what happens, but at the same time puts it in a larger context. And Bertha once told a story about Genghis Khan and the Mongol hordes riding across the steppes there, and how they would literally pick up an animal on the fly, kill it, put it under the saddle to warm it up, and then eat it from there. Now that's the sort of detail you can't ignore, I mean, what a great story. So I loved history after I heard that. I mean, but she would then use that as an entree into telling you about, basically those folks were ISIS. They were just ISIS in an earlier era. They were brutal. Mm-hmm. They went across and captured everything. They didn't govern it very well once they got it, but they were able to sweep through and grab things. And you need that historical context. And I think the Historical Society, it's a real challenge, though. How do you put that into an exhibit? Where do you find that line?
It is very difficult. We've struggled a lot with this exhibit and with what to discuss, what issues are simply too big to handle at this point in time. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because when you do talk about history that is taught, we tend to, wars are something that's emphasized.
Right.
I remember going through school, people would always say, well, how far did you make it? Did you make it up to the Vietnam War? Now, granted, I was, doing this 20 years ago, but there's this idea that these are major historical moments. Right. And a lot of people sort of roll their eyes and hate history and think it's boring because that's what history is to them. It's names, it's dates, it's wars, and that's about it.
732, the Battle of Tours with the Moors. And it rhymed.
It rhymed.
Mm-hmm.
But we also forget that it's not just a war overseas. What was going on in Lansing at that moment? Lansing was producing huge numbers of shells. Lansing was producing airplanes. I've been rereading actually some letters that were sent by a Lansing boy who enlisted in the Army just before the start of World War II. And he's writing back home to his parents who are still in the city. And he makes comments like, well, I'm really glad to hear that Mr. So-and-so's factory got a contract because we're in California. They're talking about shipping us overseas, but we don't even have enough ammunition to be able to practice, to be able to fire these weapons before we go into battle. So I'm really glad that folks back in Lansing, where everything's all set up for industry already, have got a contract to be able to produce these because the Army's really betting on this.
Bonnie, one of the things you talked about is the controversy that can come from very simple things, really. There's the day of the Pearl Harbor bombing, there was a special edition that was issued. On the bottom of that special edition, there was maybe 1-inch story about starting to round up the Japanese. The same
day. For the
day.
internment camps.
For the same day.
Exactly.
And
the idea that somehow it was a consequence of Pearl Harbor, it couldn't have been.
No, they were the same day. It was in the newspaper. They had it ready to go.
Yeah.
And it was kind of, I don't think that story is well told.
Well, this is part of the difficulty, is that going back and verifying things we think we know. Because we all think we know these things. And the reality is, if you go back and look, our memories are imperfect at best.
There's less than that.
Yeah.
We can talk about that when we talk about the open.
You should serve as COs. You should be conscientious objectors because you should not go to war against your home.
We are a nation of immigrants, and so that is part of the challenge. If you look back, Lucky Lindy, right? He was very cozy with the Nazi. We have people whose entire careers went on the rails because they were at first admirers of the Fuhrer and then had to change sides.
And what's so difficult is the fact that every time this happened, you lost huge parts of the German culture locally.
Right.
You became afraid of speaking German in public.
Yep.
You didn't do business with Germans anymore. German recipes were no longer served at restaurants and in bakeries. It changes, again, what's happening thousands of miles away changes local culture. And once that goes away, that fear comes in, it never goes back in quite the same fashion.
It helps you understand how the McCarthy era took root not that long after, during the Cold War. My father was making bomb parts in Cleveland. He was a supervisor at a Ford shop that built bomb parts during World War II. But he had both his mother and my mother's mother were card-carrying communists of the Communist Party. I mean, they came here from Lithuania. They immediately became communists. They were very active politically. And he figured the FBI was going to nail him because you really did not want to be working in a bomb factory with having those folks in your family. So he was very paranoid. And what you saw was a lot of fear on the part of people, exactly what you're talking about, that their previous activities or allegiances might come back to haunt them in this era. So it's going to be an interesting exhibit. I mean,
Thursday there's the music
Yes.
event. Tell them a little bit about that, because music is always an important part of
Yes.
war.
Oh, yeah.
You know, war affects everything, including the arts. Professor David Stowe from Michigan State is going to be giving a program called the Wartime Conscription of Swing,
Oh, wow.
looking at how war influences music. For a lot of soldiers, it was really the first war when they had radios overseas, when they had portable record players where they can play records, and music became a way of communication. For example, in the exhibit, we actually have a record that you could make, a soldier could make, and then could send home with his voice to his loved ones. But there are so many songs that talk about going to war.
Yeah.
The Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B. And some of them are very upbeat. They're very supportive of the war, sort of, wave the flag, patriotic. Others are very sad. I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places.
They're gripping.
And it reminds you that, music is a powerful tool, and that tool can even be used to support or to question war at different times. Nothing survives quite the same when the country goes
Axis
to war.
Annie and Tokyo Rose played music, and that was what, it was American culture in many ways that helped make America seem like that shining ideal. It was the music that was so captivating, and that was the musical score for many people's lives. Wow. Oh, it's going to be interesting. So tell us again what the dates are and where
Sure.
and when.
The exhibit opens on Thursday evening, so this is the 5th at Lansing City Hall. The exhibit will be open for people to take a look at starting at 6 p.m., and we encourage them to come down, look around, check out some
The
of the
heat
cases.
wave is beginning then.
And then at 7 o'clock, Professor Stowe is going to be giving his program, The Wartime Conscription of Swing.
Oh,
We'll be
that's cool.
listening to a lot of 40s music, and he'll be talking about the influences and how war changed the sound and changed the words.
Yeah. Yeah, jitterbug became the popular dance. Young people, teenagers were invented really in World War II. Prior to that, they
You know
just
what else it did? It integrated music.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah, that did start to break
And
down
that's-
those barriers.
He will start talking about that.
Oh, wow. Wow, it's going to be exciting. Yeah.
And then the exhibit will be up through the end of June, so we will have additional programming. The end of March, as I said, Mary Jane Wilson is going to be giving a program called Letters from My Father that looks at her father's World War I experience. And then there will be additional events coming up in April, May, and June.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us, and I do think this is a remarkable thing in the community because we'll give those kids history one way or the other.
We
We'll
will.
take them down there, we'll make them listen.
And we encourage people to stop by. The exhibit is open anytime Lansing City Hall is open. So that's Monday through Friday from about 7:30 in the morning to about 6 o'clock at night. The exhibit is free. It's open to the public. Stop down. You can find more information at our website, lansinghistory.org.
Sounds great. LansingHistory.org. We'll put up a notice somewhere, Facebook somewhere.